Councilmember Cormack?
Here.
Chair DuBois?
Here.
Vice Mayor Fine?
Here.
3 present.
All right, this is the Finance Committee meeting of September 24th. We have no oral communications. We have one action item, which is the CalPERS Pension Annual Valuation Report. So you want to go ahead and start?
Good evening, council members. My name is Steve Guagliardo with the Office of Management and Budget. We're here today to discuss the CalPERS annual valuation reports, and I'd just like to emphasize that this is really an informational item. It's meant to set the stage for the next round of discussions we'll have, including a discussion regarding the establishment of a pension policy, which is currently scheduled for October 15th. It's also going to impact our long-range financial forecast and how we budget over the next year. These reports are actually prepared by CalPERS actuarial staff, and they reflect their models and their assumptions. There's 2 different reports, one for miscellaneous and one for safety. So tonight we'll run through each of those reports, what's contained therein, some of the major changes from prior years, as well as the impacts on us as a city. One wrinkle for tonight's report that's different from prior years is inclusion of a discussion regarding how the city's Section 115, or PARS, Supplemental Pension Trust Fund, is impacted by these projections and how our contributions therein are included or not included in certain of CalPERS assumptions. If at any point you have questions, we can certainly get to them. There will also be plenty of time at the end to discuss. So right off the bat, we just wanted to start with some definitions to make sure we were all understanding some of the acronyms that will appear throughout this report. For some of the members of the committee who have been through this a number of times and have studied the pension issue at length, some of these might already be familiar, but we thought it was important to make sure anyone tracking the conversation could follow along. So there's the normal cost, which essentially reflects the pay-as-you-go cost of pension. This is the amount necessary where if CalPERS met their rate of return in every given year, the city would have to contribute, as well as employees would have to contribute with those investment returns to yield the necessary amounts for pensions throughout the term of an employee, so that when they retired, the full amount necessary to pay their pension was available. In any given year where CalPERS does not meet their investment return, there's an impact to the unfunded accrued liability. In a year where CalPERS falls short of its investment target, the UAL grows. In a year where CalPERS exceeds its investment target, the UAL contracts. The next term we wanted to cover was the blended rate. This is the combination of both the normal cost and the UAL as a percentage of payroll. Then there's the actuarial determined contribution, which is CalPERS calculating that blended rate and conveying it to the city. CalPERS calculates the normal cost as a percentage of payroll, and the UAL is a flat rate dollar amount. However, if you convert that flat rate dollar amount to a percentage of payroll and combined it with that normal cost, that's how you get the blended rate. And the last term we wanted to cover, and we think this covers all of the acronyms in the alphabet soup through the presentation, is additional discretionary payments. And this is any funding the city spends on pensions beyond the annual actuarial determined contribution that CalPERS provides. So our contributions to the Section 115 trust can be considered additional discretionary payments with regards to pension. With that, we wanted to touch on the overall status for where CalPERS is at as of June 30th, 2018. It's worth noting that these actuarial reports do lag 2 years, so the June 30th, 2018 valuation date is what is used to inform our FY 2021 budget. It's how long it takes them to turn the report around, that the valuation date was June 30th, 2018, and we get it in the fall of 2019.
I'm sorry. Can you just say that again? So the salaries as of 2018, we're calculating the pension shortfalls, but 2 years later?
So the way, exactly,
Okay.
that is accurate. They're using the salary census data as of June 30th, 2018, looking at the investment returns, looking at a number of different factors that we'll get through when we talk about the significant changes in assumptions in order to calculate the impact of those different returns.
Okay.
So for the year ending 2018, CalPERS did actually exceed their assumed return on investment. In the year ending June 30th, 2017, they had a rate of return of 11.6. In the year ending June 30th, 2018, they had 8.6%. These returns are offset somewhat by the de-risking strategies that have been used by CalPERS, and we'll talk more about that as we go forward a little bit. And we talk about some of the things that are not included in these actuarial valuations, and some of them are included in the significant changes in assumptions that we'll talk about in just a minute here. Overall, there's a slight decrease in the overall funded status for both the combination of the miscellaneous and the safety plans. from 65.3% of assets necessary for the total liability to 64.5% of the assets necessary for the total liability. This is broken out and detailed by individual plan. Miscellaneous went down from 66.3% to 65.8%, while safety decreased slightly from 63.5% to 62.2%. So with that, I wanted to highlight some of the significant changes in assumptions from prior years of what CalPERS has provided. The city salaries, as we just talked about, are as of June 30th, 2018. They don't reflect some of the things that have happened since then in terms of labor contracts and agreements with our different bargaining groups. CalPERS also changed their actuarial software model. They've gone to something that's a little bit more robust and they think is going to generate slightly more accurate modeling. But as a result of that recalculation, there were some impacts to our liabilities through their modeling. And the final piece is that this is the continued phase-in of a lower discount rate. So in December 2016, the CalPERS board voted to lower the discount rate from 7.5% to 7% over 3 years. Now they have done that completely, and this reflects that 7%, which will be the new ongoing discount rate used by CalPERS until the board changes it again. An element of that is they lowered the inflation assumption from 2.625% to 2.5%. And another important element to consider in CalPERS' overall assumptions is they did decrease salary growth from 2.875% to 2.75%.
And so lowering the inflation rate is actually a good thing for us. Is that right? Is that basically a drag on returns?
So the inflation rate has an impact on the returns. One of the things is it does lower it long term, but it's also one of the things driving up the valuation long term.
And is that salary growth, is that system-wide? They model a system-wide salary growth?
So they do model a system-wide salary growth, and an important element of it that needs to be clarified is that's their overall salary growth. That is essentially a COLA. That doesn't factor in people moving from step to step. That doesn't factor in those elements that happen there.
Does their new robust software model take that and figure that out a little bit more?
Yeah, so they do include all of that modeling elsewhere in their actuarial assumptions. It's just that salary growth figure is not meant to capture someone advancing through their career. That's just meant to capture year-over-year COLA increases.
So, Chair, just to your question about the inflation assumption, when we say discount rate, that 7% number, that discount rate is a combination of a inflation assumption and investment earnings. So the 7% is a combo of inflation as well as the rate of return in the market. So when you see something like the inflation rate going down from 2.625 to 2.5, that's part of the lowering of the discount rate to 7%.
And that is one of the elements of CalPERS' overall de-risking strategy, is to go with a more conservative discount rate that they think they'll be able to achieve more often to reduce the overall volatility to their funds.
Okay, so let me test my understanding. So if the inflation assumption is now 2.5, does that mean their expected rate of return on investment is 5.5 to get to the 7, or is it more complicated than that?
It's 4.5, but yeah.
Yes, that's, thank you. Long day already. Appreciate that. I had to do math up there last night. I was like, wow, I really hope somebody's double checking me on grade crossings.
And then, Councilmember Fine, to your question about salary growth beyond just the general wage increases that we see, if you look in the actual reports themselves in the appendices, Appendix A, you'll actually see that they have different salary growth rates, to Steve's point, based on duration and as well as entry age. So there are these complex tables that CalPERS uses, and depending on that, you'll see things like 17% if you have 0 years of service and you're starting at 20 years of age, because they're assuming that obviously you're going to stay in the system for a number of years and obviously grow in your career. So there are those salary growth rates in addition to the 2.75.
So this next slide shows the CalPERS past and projected employer rates for the miscellaneous group. This reflects the blended cost. So this is both the normal cost, which is the pay-as-you-go, as well as the UAL, which is the catch-up costs. So what this chart is showing us is the valuation as of 6/30/2016, when CalPERS started the phase-in of that lower discount rate. The revised statement from this same report last year with the 6/30/2017 valuation date, and then where we currently are with the 6/30/2018 valuation date. The real point of this graph is to show that in 2016, they were a little too conservative with their estimates and a little higher than where they are now. Last year, it dropped a little lower, and then as a result of all of the changes and everything that had been incorporated, we're slightly above where we were last year. It's a similar story on the safety side, but with much higher overall percentages of payroll. Again, this reflects the blended cost, both the normal cost and the UAL as you go forward. You can see that as of the 6/30/2016 valuation date, they were expecting a blended cost of 66.3%. As a result of 2 more years of experience, 2 more years of refined data, they have since brought it down. They are now projecting a 65.3% blended cost for FY 2021 for the safety groups. The biggest piece of the UAL or in the entirety of the UAL, is the unfunded accrued liability, which is the amount that is impacted by investment returns coming in higher or lower in a given year. What this area chart is showing us is the overall unfunded costs associated with both the miscellaneous and the safety groups in 2014, 15, 16, 17, and 18. This is as of June 30th of each of those dates, so it's reflecting the actuarial report from that year. You can see that in 2014, we were at 71.5% funded status overall, and we've declined since then. This decline reflects a combination of factors, but is in part driven by CalPERS' lower discount rate. When CalPERS goes from 7.5% down to 7% over 3 years, that has long-term impacts over what they think they're going to generate on those investments. So the amount of the market value of assets declines because they're going to realize fewer investment returns over the life of the pension, and as a result, the funded status goes down.
What other factors would be in there? Or is it mostly that?
So that's a big driver of it. The other thing is they changed actuarial assumptions. They did a mortality study. They did an actuarial study a couple years ago. Things like mortality rates, things like longevity and all of that tend to have an impact on that as well. And as they go through lowering inflation, as they go through lowering salary impacts, each of those things impacts the assets.
Okay, so we can assume that if we see longer longevity and decreased mortality, that's part of what's driving it up. Okay, just want to spell that out.
With the
Which we're glad about, just to be super clear.
With the forecasted 7% discount rate going forward, all else being equal, you would expect the funded status to go up because we're making our UAL payment, we're making our normal cost payments on an annual basis. The other thing that is really important to clarify is these are the numbers as generated by CalPERS. Our Section 115 trust with PARS is off to the side. CalPERS doesn't acknowledge it, CalPERS doesn't recognize it, CalPERS does not factor it into their actuarial analysis in any way, shape, or form. That was a fun glitch. Hold on one sec while I pull up.
Does CalPER allow cities to pay monthly, or they only let you pay annually?
So CalPERS allows a couple different options. You do have to pay on a pay period basis for things like the normal cost. So as you pay, that just goes. As city employees get their paychecks, it gets processed and sent to CalPERS. For the unfunded accrued liability portion, they do have an annual prepayment option or a monthly option. If you do the annual, they tend to discount it and give you a slight
Okay, so we're
discount for
doing the
that.
prepayment, not the, okay.
For the past couple of years, the city has done the prepayment option.
So we did have some members of the public show up. Did you guys want to speak, or you're just observing? Observing? Okay.
No, I guess we haven't gotten to that part yet, so no, never mind, I'll wait.
Just to clarify again, on inflation, is it the 7% plus the inflationary rate? No. So,
The 7% includes the inflationary rate. The 7% includes the inflationary rate. So the discount rate is different than your investment earnings, is different than your inflation.
Okay.
And so it's a combo of those, basically. So a piece of the 7% is inflation, a piece of it is earnings in the market. Now, obviously, when you hear from CalPERS what they're earning in the market,
Yeah.
what they're doing is they are blending it because they understand that verbally that we are articulating it and using it in the
so
same
their
way.
return on investment of 8.6% was less than the inflation rate plus the discount rate, so is that important?
8.6 would be above, because their rate is 7.25 at that point in time.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
So what was the comment about they came in slightly less?
So this past year, FY
19.
19,
Got it.
they came in slightly lower. I want to say they were at like 6.8, 6.7 or something like that. Huh? No, it's 6.7 or 6.8. And the discount rate is like 2 or 7 or 7.2. So they're just shy of it. But that assumption, that factor, is not included in CalPERS reports because they didn't have that data point at the time of creating these actuary reports. So you're probably noticing a theme. These actuary reports are extraordinarily out of date. But they are how they figure out how we're going to pay things on an annual basis. So that's one important driver for us.
Two quick things. So just looking here, if I'm looking at the 2018 column, the 455 million, that's essentially a deficit, right? It's debt accrued year after year. But then the 64.5% figure is that's just for 2018 year, right?
So
Or is that the trailing?
yeah, that's the overarching. We're 64.5% funded. So of our $1.3 billion liability or so, we have all but 455 million of it.
Okay.
So
And
we are,
nice. And then that 455 million,
Can I follow up on that one?
yeah.
So the report says that our plans are below the overall CalPERS numbers, right? So the overall CalPERS number is higher. Can you, in layman's terms, explain so we can all do a better job explaining why that is?
yeah, I can certainly start with it. So CalPERS is looking at its overall, every single fund when it's talking about its overall status. The city of Palo Alto, as an institution that's been around for 125 years now, is a mature organization in CalPERS' mind. We have a really long tail of people who have been and come through and have been invested in CalPERS and are retired and are being paid out. Much smaller jurisdictions with less robust service offerings, with fewer employees, are at different stages of that maturity scale. So even though we are below CalPERS' overall funded status, it's largely results of that.
So the average doesn't really reflect where we are. Have we ever looked at comparables for other mature organizations? Or is that not helpful?
Yeah.
I'm just curious.
Cities
with
with utilities probably, right?
Yeah,
100.
okay, just curious. Okay, thanks.
Just one last one. I also read in the report, so it said currently you have to pay off the UAL in 30 years, but CalPERS is shifting to 20 years. What does that mean for us?
So when the technical difficulties were experienced, we still got to the next slide's content anyways, so I'll just go ahead and move us there for this discussion. So right now, if CalPERS, as they did, return a 6.7% investment return for the year that just ended June 30, 2019, there's that gap, right, in what they expected to receive and what they actually got. That is going to be amortized over 20 years because it'll be factored into the June 30th, 2019. So what it means is we're going to be responsible for paying off the difference between what 7.25% investment return would have yielded and what the 6.7% actually yielded over the next 20 years.
So it's just the UAL for that fiscal year. That is now under the 20-year repayment. The other stuff is still 30.
Yeah.
But eventually we'll pay it off and all of them will be 20 years going forward.
Yep.
So we're gonna have two tiers of debt. We're gonna have two
Terms.
tiers of unfunded liability. We'll have the existing is still on the 30-year, and then any new is on a 20-year?
Right. And so the way, it's all still one unfunded liability, but it's different.
But it has two components.
Right. There's multiple components. There's from an actuarial perspective, they're called bases. And so any year's loss is a given base. And so you'll have multiple bases over different horizons, depending on what it is. As Councilmember Fine asked, the UAL bases are going to be on a 20-year time span going forward. So you are right. There will be some that are going out 30 years, even as the new ones are only 20 years and are shorter than that. And so there will be some room at the end for those final bases to be paid off.
How will they decide 2 years from now, or do we decide which of those bases our payments are attached to?
So we, I believe, can work with CalPERS, and this is something that'll come up on October 15th when we're talking about the pension policy conversation a little bit more, and I think it's probably more ripe for that particular
Of
conversation.
course.
But one of the things we're looking at is targeting specific bases and saying we want to target those 30-year ones versus a 20-year one versus this, that, or the other thing. They're all, I will just say, there are different trade-offs associated with targeting different bases.
Actually, if the committee would turn to packet page 29 and 30, I think visually it might be helpful to kind of see what Steve's talking about. When Councilmember Cormack said there are two sets of bases, a 30-year and a 20-year, in reality, we actually have at least one every year. So if we do well in the market or we do poorly in the market, or CalPERS, I'm speaking in a general sense, if CalPERS does poorly or positively in the market, those benefits are amortized each year over a 30-year period. So it's almost like each year that passes is a base and is like another debt service, is kind of, or a mortgage as I think about it. And so those losses or gains are amortized over a 30-year period. And so what Steve was referring to is what CalPERS does is they do the calculation based on the amortization period. So it's done whenever the loss or gain was had, they amortize it over 30 years. Now moving forward, it'll be over 20 years, just like a debt service schedule. However, we could choose as an organization, policy-wise, and this is where the October 15th conversation comes into play, to take one of these bases and say, we want to pay it off sooner. Or let's take one last year. It's got a negative 2.6, I think balance was as of 6/30/18. That's over 30 years, and we could say, you know what, I want to fresh start that. I just want to pay it off now. I don't want to pay off 2.6 million over 30 years. I just want to pay it off now. And we could do that and fresh start it and basically eliminate that.
Okay, so the key with the bases is not how long it's amortized for, is that we have a different one for every single one of these years.
And how, well, and the,
And that'll be baked into the next one. The fact that it's at 20 will be baked into this number in the far right-hand column.
Correct.
Okay.
correct.
The negative amount means they pay us, or they owe
Actually,
us.
in this report, I think it's the opposite.
It's the opposite.
Yeah, gains are in the parentheses, losses are look like positive numbers.
Okay. And so would it make sense to ask them to pay us all of their money immediately and stretch our money out? Is that an
No,
option?
if you look, you were negative.
So we amortize the gain, or they amortize the gains for us
Correct.
also.
Yep.
That's what I'm saying. But
Yeah, yeah, I know.
If colleagues say we could basically call it, can we
Get
call
it
all
today.
the amounts they owe us
In a good
and
year.
amortize theirs?
Yeah.
Well, and if you look, the expected payments, they're all zeros for those years that are.
While we're on that, can we talk about the ramp? Because that was also in here, and
Well, wait, but I would still like to clarify. I understand this. So if it's negative
If it's got parentheses, that's a year that there
Sure.
was a gain.
or a gain.
A gain in the market compared to the
Yeah,
earnings.
So the return was higher and
Then-
we don't have a liability or
For the,
Given.
the normal
that given
cost.
year, the gain in the market was greater than, the expected returns
Yeah.
of the market.
And so if you look at the June 30th, 18. This is in millions, or,
These are pure dollars.
so we would have an additional, where's the right balance, I guess? But we're basically paying down our UAL, right?
Correct.
Right.
When there's a gain, and so you're earning more than the plan had assumed,
Yeah.
then that helps deal with your unfunded
But
liability,
then
because
those
your overall
payments are
assets go
Stretched
larger.
over 30 years in this case?
Which payments?
The-
There are no payments
the-
when there's a gain.
I guess payments from, I'm calling it a payment from them to us, but I guess it would go against our UAL, right? They would,
That added revenue or
Yeah.
added value.
right, does it happen all at once, or does it get stretched out over 30 years?
No, it's smoothed.
It's the same.
It's the same. Okay. What's up?
Yeah, the question is like, why?
The point is to smooth the impacts, right? If you have a gangbuster year, you're gonna actually smooth those impacts over a longer term, because CalPERS is playing a long game.
But if we applied it all at once, wouldn't it decrease our interest for our UAL?
If you applied it all at once, what
So
is,
if they have a
help me
good year,
understand.
and we basically have paid more than we would owe, or our normal costs are covered, right?
Mm-hmm.
If we applied the overage all at once to our UAL, then isn't it like making an extra payment on your mortgage? I mean, aren't we paying down the unfunded liability?
I mean, in theory, overall, when they're looking at your total assets and your total liabilities, they're making those longer term assumptions for you. I'm not sure if I'm understanding the question correctly.
I think what Chair Du Bois is getting at is if there's a year where we have a quote-unquote bumper crop and we have an overage in our expected, or in our returns versus our expected returns, we're covering the normal cost and we have some money that CalPERS is quote-unquote crediting us. And it seems right now they're using that money, keeping it in our portfolio. I guess they're reinvesting it, right? And then spreading that overage over 30 years. What Councilmember Du Bois is asking is, could we just, in the year that we have that, bumper crop, just put it right into our existing UAL deficit? I mean, are there rules against that, or is that just a bad idea?
Yeah, I think it really comes down to how CalPERS manages it, and it is, to my knowledge and research thus far, not an option to just use it as a lump sum. It is amortized over the same period, whether it's a gain or a loss. To quickly pivot a little bit to Councilmember Cormack's question, there is a 5-year ramp up, then there is 20 years at a certain level, and then there's a 5-year ramp down on the bases that were 30 years. When they change it to 20 years, the ramp will change likely, but there will still be a ramp up and ramp. I think they're getting rid of the ramp down or something. I gotta clarify that a little bit.
If it's the other way, where there's a shortage, right, and we have to make additional payments, we have the option of paying that all at once. So that's only a one-way thing, is what you're saying.
CalPERS will always take your money.
Yes. Okay.
It's called an additional ADP, additional discretionary payment. And so anytime you send them money beyond what's required by these reports, that's what they call that. And so we do have the option to do something like that.
And at the risk of weighing in when I shouldn't, because I'm a generalist, I'm going to ask a question anyway. My recollection is also that if we start thinking about these as discrete years instead of taking the long view, when we run the risk of making poor decisions like the jurisdictions that throttled back contributions in bumper crop years, to use the language, and the assumption is that you're going to have high years and you're going to have low years, and it evens out in the end. So if we don't benefit from the bumper crop years, we end up with what we've got now, which is the UAL. So part of the assumption, right, is that yeah, okay.
And just to clarify my earlier comment about the ramp, beginning next year, gains and losses will still ramp up, but they won't ramp down at the end. It'll just fall off at the end.
Can you explain the ramp? I'm not sure I quite understand what it is.
Sure. So Kylie, can you remind me what page number you were looking at in the packet? So on page 30 of the packet,
Yeah.
you can see all the different bases.
Yep.
And you can see that some of them are at a ramp up or ramp down. And you can see that like the gain loss for the 6/30/2018 year is at 20%. Then there's a little arrow next to it indicating that it's still ramping up. And what that's saying is that they're at 20% of what that base is going to get to. It'll go up again next year, and the second year it's acknowledged. It'll go up again the next year, and the next year, and the next year, until it gets to 100% of where it'll be. So it's another element of what Michelle was referring to of the smoothing, and it's really meant to minimize the volatility that a plan will feel in a given year. So when you have that gangbuster year, it doesn't instantly distort and throw off what you're trying to plan for from a budgetary level. CalPERS is interested in investing in a very long-term horizon. They are interested in rate stabilization over a very long-term horizon. As such, they will ramp it up so you can slowly phase it in for both gains and losses.
A good way to look at it, Councilmember, if you want to look at a specific line, would be the gain or loss line for 6/30/15. If you look at the expected payment in FY19, it's about 416,000. Then in it jumps to 641,000, and then in 21 it jumps to 864,000. It's because it's going through that ramping period, getting up to the full what the full annual payment should be, or debt service, even though this is not debt. I'm just trying to akin it to something. Whereas if you look above, say the third line down, which just says benefit change 6/30/05, you can see the payment is rather stable. They're all in the 700,000-ish range, because they're in that period of there's no ramping anymore. We're at the full maturity of it.
So the rationale for this, though, I mean, we're responsible for this, the 100% when in a year, right? Is this like one of those things we're never gonna catch up with if they're ramping?
In theory, no. In theory, it's like a mortgage, and it's just like you have a 5-year grace period when that mortgage payment comes, and instead of having that full, let's say you have a $10,000 a month mortgage, dear God, I don't know who can pay that, but it's a round number. If you have a $10,000 a month mortgage, instead of on year one of your mortgage paying $10,000 a month, you start at $2,000, and the next year it's going to be $4,000 a month, and the next year it's going to be $6,000 a month.
Yeah, but you're still responsible for the full
But you're still
amount at the
responsible,
beginning.
correct.
That's the point.
Yes.
All right, I understand it's not our choice, it's just, it adds to the understanding of how we can accrue liabilities quickly.
But a base year stays fixed over its life, right? A base
After
payment.
it's ramped.
No, that's the payment. The payment ramps up, right? But the actual amount from a given base year is fixed across the life of that thing, right?
Well, right. It's the amount that you're curing of those base years is fixed because it's the
Right.
difference. It's
So, I
the
mean-
gains or losses of that year.
Right, there's no interest on it, essentially, to use the same
Well,
metaphor.
I mean, there's an escalation rate, but
There's an escalation rate on the base year, each base year?
well, of course, because if you didn't earn, so for example, if 10 years ago we lost $50 million in the market, and over the course of the last 10 years, we lost a lot by not having that 50 million in our coffers. So not only did you lose the 50 million 10 years ago, you lost the interest or the rate of return you would have earned on it over
Okay.
the future years.
But vice versa for a bumper crop year.
We don't seem to have a lot of those.
We do.
Yeah. I think we just talked a lot about CalPERS, and what we would really like to emphasize is that CalPERS is an element of it, but for the city of Palo Alto, CalPERS is not the entirety of our pension funding. Through actions over the past few years, the city of Palo Alto has contributed to its Section 115 trust. Council gave direction last October to more conservatively budget. Rather than use the CalPERS provided discount rate, we use the 6.2% discount rate for normal cost. So what this chart is showing is the employee normal cost and the employer normal cost. City of Palo Alto employees pay into their pensions right alongside the city as contributors to calculate what the total normal cost is for both miscellaneous, those two columns on the left, and safety, the two columns on the right. What this graph is showing you is, what this chart is showing you rather, is the normal cost as calculated by CalPERS, and the normal cost as calculated by us using a software called GovInvest to model that 6.2% discount rate for both miscellaneous and for safety. you can see that it goes from 18.83% total for miscellaneous to 22.56. And then on safety, it goes from 30.9 to about 37.5. If you apply this to what CalPERS estimates are for us for payroll, you would see additional costs of about $3.3 million on the miscellaneous side and about $1.7 million on the safety side. One thing I want to make sure is clear to the Finance Committee, because this is something that came up throughout budget hearings, is why aren't we seeing why is it only $5 million? Why aren't we seeing a contribution of $6.2 million ongoing? The short answer is CalPERS lowered their discount rate again. So the gap we have to make up from our 6.2% discount rate to what CalPERS set is smaller.
So the current council policy is to cover the normal cost, which on this table would be an additional $5 million. Is that correct? Okay. And then the discussion we have is we are growing our unfunded liability, right? And do we try to cover some of that so that we actually start to pay down our total, right?
I think that's another important element of a pension policy, and normalizing and formalizing what that looks like is addressing exactly what we want to be dealing with. With a normal cost calculated at 6.2%, you are covering when CalPERS gets a rate of return beneath theirs, but above that 6.2%.
Right.
So last year's a great example. They generated 6.7%. Well, our normal cost calculation, if they did that again this coming year, would have covered that. And so part of it is looking at how do we want to position ourselves long-term to make sure that we are setting aside funding in that PARS trust to be doing what we want to be doing.
Yeah, the interaction with the unfunded liability is complicated, right? Because of these different rates. Right now, it's continuing to grow because of these factors that we talked about, right?
Right. And so what I think is going to be critically important is as CalPERS stabilizes a little bit in terms of things like their discount rate, in terms of some of those assumptions that they've been ramping down and scaling down, to see what that impacts us as from a plan perspective as we're making our payments to CalPERS for both UAL and for normal cost. So now that we've isolated the variables of all of those discount rates changing and those impacts on our actuarial positioning, what happens? All else being equal, in 30 years we should have paid down the UAL. In 30 years we should be at a much better funded status if CalPERS meets its investment return each year. Correct. We've stopped digging is kind of one way to think about it.
Well, we're still digging right now, but, right?
Yes, we're still digging a little bit. Well, no, if CalPERS is at 6.2%, we're even.
So we are at 6.2% for budgeting, and the most recently they had 6.7% as
Right,
their
so we've
investment
got
return.
0.5%.
But our UAL payments aren't covering the growth of the UAL, right?
No, it will in 30 years, all else equal. Right, as long as we get like 6.2% or higher from CalPERS, we're okay. We know that they're gonna go below that.
Just to cover the normal costs for this year.
Right, but if we're covering the normal cost, we're not contributing to the UAL.
It also depends on the return on the PARS 115 trust, which is
Yeah.
invested more conservatively than CalPERS, which we will be discussing in October.
Yeah.
So that, there's more than one variable.
For sure.
So this next slide is showing the average cost by plan for both miscellaneous and safety for an employee, with the total cost at $208,000 for miscellaneous and the total cost at safety for $342,000. What is critical to understand about this graph is the marginal cost associated with that 6.2% calculation for normal cost and for UAL. So for the miscellaneous group, it comes out to about $4,000. Which is a little less than 2%, or right around 2% on $200,000 total cost. And for the safety group, it comes out to about $10,000, or about 3% on a $342,000 compensation.
What's the marginal UAL?
So the UAL is a little more difficult to calculate the impact for as you're looking at these horizons and such. When we've done it in the past and where the calculation landed again is it was about $1,000 more per. The normal cost is the primary driver of it. If you go through different calculations, the impact on the UAL is a little different, especially if you're trying to say what you want a discount rate to be, essentially refinancing your mortgage at with that new discount rate.
So,
Let me-
Councilmember,
let me see
you're
if
asking the-
Let me see if I try and understand this. The pink, the light pink is the unfunded accrued liability as a percent of payroll using the 7.0%
Correct.
CalPERS discount rate.
Correct.
So the marginal UAL is this secondary calculation we have to do separate from the normal cost, also using 6.2 instead of 7.
Correct.
Okay.
I guess to say it another way, it's what the additional 0.8% in the discount rates would cost, the difference? Okay,
Yep.
okay.
So this slide is really what we're trying to speak to a little bit tonight, and more so when we get to the pension policy discussion. This is the full picture. So Councilmember Fine had asked earlier, like, this is just the unfunded status, but our funded status is below at that 64.5% level. So this is using our pension modeling software, GovInvest, and it's looking at our market value of assets and our unfunded liability per CalPERS. So according to that modeling, right, the unfunded accrued liability for FY 2020 is about 455 million, comparable to CalPERS. That's what you'd expect to see through a system that's trying to replicate CalPERS. And then there's that market value of assets. Again, this is comparable to what CalPERS has in their modeling. What you see in that band that's in between the green and the blue is the impact of our contributions to the PARS Section 115 Trust. It starts off with our contributions to date through FY 2020. That'll be about $22 million. As you go through the next few years, you end up reaching more than $55 million in those additional contributions. What GovInvest is trying to model is if you transmitted those fundings to CalPERS, what would the impact be on your UAL? Because to CalPERS, that diagonal band doesn't exist. It's still unfunded in their mind. But we know, as a council and as a community, that we've taken steps to proactively address that pension liability.
And if I'm looking, so this is the UAL, assuming we're not adding to it, right, because we're covering the normal cost year after year. It would be helpful, I know we can't do this on the fly here, to understand in each fiscal year, what is the UAL, what is our annual payment to that that's actually just happening as of matter of business, and then what is the potential that we could get if we were to do this, ADP essentially /115, right? Because there's like kind of three components to that. There's the UAL as a whole, what we're obligated to pay, and what we can pay additionally or put in our 115. And that's how we draw it down.
So page 4 of the CMR, and I apologize, I'm not sure what packet page it is, but Table 4 does show the projected UAL payments in dollars for both miscellaneous and safety through FY 2026, as provided by CalPERS. Thank you.
This is in FY 2019, we paid 26 million,
Correct.
26.8 million. And in 2024, we'll be paying 43.8 million. Okay.
And to the council member's point,
Against the UAL.
It's correct. That's just against the UAL. That does not contemplate normal cost. And one of the things to articulate as we go forward with the pension policy discussion is identifying what the trade-offs are associated with that. So if we want to do rate stabilization, we can talk about what the impacts of that might be. And there are other options to pursue in terms of additional contributions and what that can yield longer term.
This is what CalPERS tells us we owe them each year, right, to pay off that 30-year, or some of it's blended with the 20 years. Okay. So I guess just like this is something that's probably not that clear to the entire council, but also to the public. If we pay our normal cost every year, which is part of the plan of the 6.2%, using that discount rate, our unfunded account does not grow anymore. And we are required to pay it off in 30 years. And we will do that, right? It's not like the sky is always falling, sort of thing. Okay. And we have ability to pay more into it, either from the 115 or via ADPs, and that's a policy choice of, how we want to save or spend the money and
So
what we're
I wanna be
targeting.
really absolutely clear on this. So I get what you just said about the normal cost. But then CalPERS,
We had that much money from
Yeah. CalPERS is also saying that we need to make a UAL payment. And they are also making assumptions about that. And so if they are off on that, well, we're not putting enough against the trust, and that's growing, right?
If
So
they're
they're
off,
assuming 7% return on this unfunded liability portion.
True, too, yeah.
So that's the piece that we haven't addressed yet, that the
Yeah.
council originally was
It's
saying
unfunded,
we should
unfunded.
go beyond the first
Yeah.
4 million. Right,
Yeah.
okay. And then this chart, what's the 455 million? What is,
So that's the unfunded portion. So a few slides ago, we saw what the unfunded total was for both miscellaneous and safety, and it's just the unfunded portion of that blue line, that
So-
blue section of the graph.
so the 1.6 is how much is funded?
So the 1.6 is the total liability, and so by 2026, we will have all but 369 million funded of that.
But our total liability has gone up.
Correct, because we're going to have people continuing to enter the workforce. They'll continue to mature through. The pension benefit will grow. The pension benefit will be more costly. Let me be more clear.
But it's, okay, let me,
But you have more assets
so it's
to
funded.
handle the growing liability.
With
So the unfunded liability, remember, is not necessarily your total liability and growth. It's what portion of your liability you
Right.
don't have an asset to fund it with.
Right,
So as you see your liability, as Steve said, grow from 1.4 to 1.6, the asset grows with it.
So,
oh, sorry, so the growth of that liability will still mean more of our budget goes to payroll and benefits, right?
Not necessarily. No, not necessarily. I mean, your budget from a CalPERS perspective is based on those two factors, normal cost and UAL. So again, all things being equal, if we're making our payments, and they're meeting their returns and their actuarial assumptions, then in 30 years, you pay it off. Now, again, that's all things in the world being equal over a 30-year period of time.
Okay, sorry,
no, it's on this exact same thing. I'm just trying to connect the dots. So if we were to put a percentage in the green bars, those would be from the earlier table, the numbers going up, right?
Yeah, you end up reaching almost 80%.
Okay, so another thing that might be helpful for people who are not going to spend as much time on this as we all are collectively, would be putting in the blue bars that number so they can see it going down, right? So just so we understand the progress we're making in both directions. Okay, so everybody doesn't have to remember things from the prior slide, which might be a lot to ask depending on how late we cover this.
So the next slide helps illustrate a question that was just raised about how do you transmit funding, what does it do? So this funding chart shows what happens if you did what CalPERS calls a fresh start. So CalPERS gives you the option of refinancing and locking yourself into a shorter amortization base for either plan, miscellaneous or safety. For the miscellaneous group, you can do it over 20 years or 15 years. For the safety group, you can do it over 15 years or over 10 years. So what that orange one represents is the fastest you could reamortize it. The blue line represents a slightly longer, but still quicker than CalPERS overall actuarial projections. Overall, if you were to pursue that more accelerated one, you would save $186.7 million over the 30 years kind of remaining on the liability. But at its peak, you would owe $20.3 million more in a single year than you would under CalPERS' longer base model. For the blue one, the slightly less quick one, it'd be only $18.6 million higher in the highest peak year of expenses, and it would save you $63.8 million over the life of it. Again, this is something we can talk about more when we talk about the pension policy on October 15th. The fresh start is irrevocable. When you commit to it, you are locked in. As Kylie mentioned earlier, CalPERS will always take your money, and there's nothing they love than taking your money even faster. So if you commit to this, it becomes the new normal.
Is the main reason cities would do this is to get out of the CalPERS system? Like you would eventually buy it down and then be able to exit?
I think the main interest, again, less mature plans might have is the peak might be less impactful and the savings could be a comparable proportion of it. And so it really just depends on a case-by-case basis what that city's particular goals are and what the revenue streams and projections are.
Let me be sure I understand the colors here, Mr. Guagliardo. So the orange was safety and the blue was miscellaneous, or it was a combo?
So each is a combo, and
Okay.
each is reflecting the fastest you could get to with either plan.
Okay, we have an orange option and a blue option.
Correct.
And right now, we're on the light yellow-green option.
Correct. We are currently on that Palo Alto green plan.
I'm trying to think of the artist who does this sort of like tissue paper, like collage, because I feel like we're back in the art center study session. This is super helpful. Thank you. Yeah.
So just one question on that. If we choose the orange lump, 186 million of savings, that is 186 million over 30 years. So is that today money, or is that not discounted?
Yeah, so that has not been discounted. That's not ran through net present value or anything. That's just looking apples to apples, total dollars versus total dollars.
Okay. So I mean, because part of we're not there at this point, but we may want to just, inflate away our debt.
Right. And what is the weird step?
So that step reflects the kind of the ramp down of the amortized base. The big drop for the orange one that you can see reflects the fact that you are through the 10 years for miscellaneous, and then you've only got the 5 years remaining on safety to carry you through. CalPERS, again, they gave it to us. This is how they've done it for a couple of years now. They give you miscellaneous reamortized over 15 and over 10 years, and then, and then safety, they
Okay.
give you 20 and 15, so.
And we could break those out, right? I mean, we could say, public safety, we want to do in the 15-year, and miscellaneous just stay in the 30-year.
They are
Okay.
two different plans, and again, something we'll talk about more when we talk about the pension policy is what aspects of it can be done without locking yourself into a fresh start. So a mechanism we've seen other cities do is make those additional discretionary payments to CalPERS, in effect, following along. What was the term you used earlier today?
Fresh start in concept.
Where you're basically making the fresh start payment, but you haven't contractually handcuffed yourself to that payment schedule.
Yep. So there's no penalty for paying in advance.
Steve, is that sort of the equivalent of, instead of refinancing my mortgage from 30 years to 15 years, I'm just going to pay extra every month and ask them to put it toward the principal?
Yep, that is a very comparable analogy.
Just for the committee's reference, the chart that you're just looking at, there are actual dollars to it if you want in the actual actuarial reports themselves, both for each plan. So you can see the differences in the annual payments, the peaks and the valleys, so to speak.
So have past finance committees talked about different policies for safety from MISC, or they've always said we're going to do the same policy for both?
At least since I've been here, we have not necessarily talked about bifurcating, but I wouldn't say that that is an intentional act. I think we haven't talked about bifurcating because we haven't gotten to the idea of like a solid policy that we're gonna abide by. We have been thus far making strides and taking steps, but we haven't necessarily nailed down the ongoing path. And so, we've discussed the options associated with, separating different plans or picking different base years to do a fresh start, or doing the whole plan as a fresh start. But I think the committee has been generous in their time and leniency as we work our way through figuring out the longer term strategy.
I think the committee was pretty proactive in taking the bold step to direct us to start budgeting with an eye toward a 6.2 discount rate instead of a 7% discount rate. And so I think that's as far as we've gotten,
Yeah.
which was pretty far.
Which again was a huge first step, and then there's this unfunded UAL, which would be, I think, the second step, right? And if we just did that without a fresh start, then we would at least know we're going to pay this down over some time period. I don't want to continue to grow unbounded, right? there's a little bit of, I don't know how much past finance committees discussed this as well, but I mean, there's kind of a question about the whole CalPERS system, right? And all these cities having unfunded liabilities. And is there a risk if we're the responsible city and put in more money into the system and then it ends up going bankrupt or getting restructured, right? I mean, how do you think about that in terms of like a fresh start, which would have us pay much larger payments into the system?
Yes and no. It's a fair question, Chair. I will say to terminate your membership with CalPERS would be extraordinarily expensive. There's a, I'm trying to find it.
1.2 billion.
Yeah, I'm
Yeah.
trying to find it in the report, because there is a clause.
It is in there, but
It is, on what it would look like to terminate.
yeah, so I'm not suggesting we terminate, but, you know, it's a
We-
question of like, if you make additional payments, is that smart or foolish?
When we make payments, we are a separate agency. Because of our longevity and our size, we are not a pooled agency. So we have our own account with CalPERS. So they are tracking our employees, our contributions, to us as a unique organization identifier. We are not a pooled asset. So as we make individual additional contributions or ADPs, they would be credited specifically towards Palo Alto. I'm not a lawyer, so if there were to be legislative changes or court changes due to something as drastic as, say, a bankruptcy, not to suggest that they're anywhere near that, but
Right.
just, I actually don't know how lenient they could be, but I do know that we are not in a pooled account.
It's not insured though, right? I mean, in that sense, I mean, it's just something to think about, again, like,
It's fair.
that's why we kind of put money in a trust instead of handing it over to CalPERS, right?
I think part of what is also embedded in your question perhaps is there's the math and the financial analysis, but there's also sort of the strategic question of, do we want to be the most fiscally conservative city in the state, and does that somehow work against us at some point if there's a broader system-wide correction somewhere down the
Well,
road?
it's a little bit separate.
Right.
We could be fiscally conservative and put our money in this trust. And it's a little bit different than, that's what I'm trying to say, than giving it to CalPERS and then, again, something political happens with the whole system statewide. So,
The intended use, I think, of the trust and how we use it is a really good one, and something that we absolutely need to sharpen our pencils on. And as you said, we'll cover that as part of the 15th meeting when we talk about pension policy. Because, you know, in the muni world, so to speak, you hear different opinions from different finance directors and different organizations on how to use trusts or separate accounts versus sending money directly to CalPERS. And it all depends on how you want to use it and what you want to use it for. I think Councilmember Cormack noted earlier, our trust is in a more conservative investment pool. So if our intent is actually to have a separate account that is, because we don't trust CalPERS, or we want to shield ourselves from any potential catastrophe from an organizational perspective, and we don't intend to draw funds from that trust in any near term, right? CalPERS is on a 2030, they're looking long term. Then we probably need to rethink our investment strategy. But if we are thinking of using that trust fund for more near-term things like rate smoothing for ourselves, or dealing with changes in CalPERS assumptions that they may coming down the line, so that we don't instantly have to react on a dime, we've got some time to plan as an organization, then that would beg a different investment policy from that perspective. And it also doesn't preclude us from doing both. We could do both money to the trust fund or a separate account outside of CalPERS and send ADPs directly to CalPERS. So if we say, well, we want to aggressively or more aggressively invest, we'll put that money with CalPERS, and these other pieces, if I want to split it 50-50, I'm just making this up. We could choose something like that as well. Know that once money goes into CalPERS, like I said, it does not come out of CalPERS. And once money goes into the trust, it can only be used for pension costs. However, there are other ways that help from managing the financials of an organization. For example, like I said, if we needed to smooth out a change in CalPERS, we could send some money from the trust to buffer the city while the city reacts and adjusts to those financial needs. So all great questions for next conversation about this. Councilmember Cormier?
So, a few questions about the trust. One is, would we actually pay employees out of it, or would it would all go to CalPERS to pay? Okay, I was just trying to understand like the structure of it. And then sort of related to this, and we were talking about the maturity, I did note in their report packet, page 11, this note that as plans mature, they become much more sensitive to risk than plans that are less mature. Is that something we should be considering? The bottom, it was talking about changes from previous year's valuations. Packet page 11, the very bottom. Bless you. New metrics on plan maturity. I guess here's how I was thinking about this, just since we're using sort of, things that average consumers can understand. If you are saving for your child to go to college and you start when they're a baby, by the time they're in high school, you want that plan to be in something less risky. Is that what they're getting at? And is that what we should be considering in terms of the duration of the 115 trust? You don't have to answer, but this is just things maybe for us to talk about in October.
Yeah, and I think you're touching on something critically important, which is the intent of the investment, the time horizon of the investment, and the scale of the investment are all the underpinnings that should be informing a policy.
Okay. So good news is we've started saving, and the next step is to be sure that we're doing it for the right time frame, and therefore investing it in the right things with the right risk tolerance. Okay.
So we also have additional unfunded benefits, right? Is that separate from this?
So if you're referring to other post-employment benefits like retiree health, we do. We have a separate trust, the SERP trust for that, and that's actually a really good analog for where we are now with the PARS Section 115 pension conversation. For context, the SERP fund was started in 2008 with a principal investment of about $32 million. As you might remember, 2008 was not the best year to invest, and it ended up declining pretty precipitously within its first year. However, after a decade now of steady contributions ranging from about $3 million to $5 million, it's reached, plus all of the investment returns from it, it's at almost $110 million in trust assets for it. And so one of the things to keep in mind as we look at where we are with the pension conversation is we're essentially at $22 million through the end of FY 2020. We have a program mechanism to continue funding it. What's the horizon? What's the intent? What's the risk tolerance we want to pursue? And what do we want to do with it?
So does OPEB come to finance? I mean, is that liability growing as well, or is this trust keeping up?
So the OPEB report, the city does one at least biannually, so we are actually due for one this year. So staff is working with a firm to have them do an actuarial analysis of our OPEB accounts. I suspect that won't come until the new calendar year. And it will be an important part of the next year's budget development. I'm trying to think of what we did in the last report 2 years ago. I want to say overall we were better situated than we are from a pension perspective in terms of our funded ratios, and that again is contributing to why we have the trust.
If I'm recalling that report correctly, there was, if I'm doing it from your perspective, it was a nearer time horizon when we sort of reached a point that was more comfortable. It was within 10 years. I think if I'm also recalling the conversation correctly, that was like perpetually within 10 years. So I think there were some forecasting questions
that's my
there.
question. It's like,
Yeah.
is it growing faster than the fund is growing, the liability?
Well, and remember you also have two funds. There's with CalPERS, and then there's our OPEB trust.
I'm talking about the OPEB trust
The trust
specifically.
fund?
Like the retiree medical benefits, are those costs going up faster than the the funding of the trust.
We'd have to look into that. Yep.
So, what can we do with this GovInvest tool? I mean, is there some scenarios that we might think of tonight that would be useful when you guys come back?
So I think we're a little early for that conversation just yet. I think addressing those underpinnings first through the next week's conversation could tee up that conversation a little bit better to refine the scenarios we need to model. I will say that GovInvest can certainly help with some of that modeling. It is a supplement, not a replacement for actuarial analysis. And so to the extent we really start pursuing some of these options and want to see and articulate what the impact is of doing some payments at different points to CalPERS, engaging with Bartel and Associates or another outside actuary would really help refine that story too.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't know if council members had scenarios in mind that it might be useful to share.
I don't know if I have a scenario specifically in mind, but I think what Councilmember Cormack and I were talking about on that one graph with the green and blue bars, maybe just a nice thing to see, like, how does it play out? You know, all else equal, assuming the UAL is static and we're not increasing it, you know, how does that 29 million per year, the obligation look, and what does it look like, you know, if we're doing the additional payment or socking it away in the 115?
Yeah.
That's kind of like the current steady state, I guess.
Right. Yeah, I'm really interested, like, how do we get to some kind of steady state? And, you know, if we have unfunded liability, is that,
Yeah.
what do we do with that? If we try to make a catch-up, does it go back into the trust, or does it go to?
I mean, maybe it's actually, you know, to address the unfunded part, maybe we start with that one, right, at the 7%, and then, you know, call me crazy, but maybe we just do another scenario of 6.2% on the unfunded.
Right.
Same graph, same set of tables, just, you know, those two scenarios. And that helps us understand a bit of the risk of the UAL.
And possibly, I mean, I know we ramped, right, this first one, right? We sort of did it in two phases. There were things that were one time and there were things that were ongoing, right? And it took us 2 years to get to where we needed to be, right? So if I think about what we were talking about earlier with, you know, the on-ramp that they use, I think it's reasonable if that's gonna be a chunk, and I can't imagine it's not gonna be a
You mean
chunk.
2 years and saving the money in the budget?
Take 2 years, maybe it might take us 2 years to get to the point where we could save that amount. It's just,
Yeah.
I'm just thinking
You're talking
forward.
about cutting the 4 million in the budget? Is that what
I
you're
don't know that
referring
it's
to?
4 million.
No,
I'm saying
in
that,
the past.
so what I'm saying is, if we go from 7 to 6.2 on the unfunded, I'm willing to bet that that amount is significant enough that it might take us 2 years to save that full amount in a year. So those graphs, we could have two versions, one that shows like if you did what might be a shock to the system and if you did sort of a step.
Got it. Okay.
So a two-year ramp, I guess, or whatever looks appropriate.
Okay.
I have one other question on the report. I don't know where we are in our process here.
I think we're wrapping up.
Okay, may I ask just my last question then is on packet page 28, awful lot of like gain loss analysis here. And the part that I was really interested in is there's interest on expected contributions and there's interest on actual contributions. Like, I just don't understand why there would be interest. Is there some delay in when they invest it? Is it like any investment where some of it's in a money market fund before they invest it? It's in section 2. There's like lots of interests. Interest on expected contributions, interest on actual contributions, 2B and 2D on packet page 28.
Right. And so what they're doing is getting you to your contribution gain and loss for the year. And so 2A and 2B are what they had for us in the actuarial study from 6/30/2016 for
This is the
6/30/17.
delta. Okay.
Yep, so it's saying what they expected to get and the interest they expected to get on that contribution. Then there's what was actually contributed. The only reason they would get less is because we had more vacancies than they thought. So our payroll was slightly less, so the normal cost that we paid in was slightly less. But that means that we generated $5,000 less in interest. So that 14,430 on row E represents 2A plus 2B.
Or not
F,
to be.
yeah.
Sorry.
And F shows what was not to be, because we only, as a
Touche.
combination of the two, they only got 14.2 296, and so the difference of that is 134,000. So they're
And
saying
again, the whole reason there's interest is it's sitting in an account before it gets invested. Is that just part of the process? Okay.
it's just the regular flow through of funds.
All right, but
for
they are at
CalPERS.
least giving us interest.
Correct.
Okay, great. Thank you.
So I think one other area to understand again, and we touched on a little bit, was on these unfunded components. Do we end up paying interest in some way with CalPERS? So if we're making additional payments for normal costs or for unfunded UAL, but we're putting them in the trust, so CalPERS isn't aware, are we incurring any additional expense because of that? That if we paid CalPERS directly, we would save?
Sure, of course.
We are?
We use a third party to invest our trust, so PARS is a company. So there are administrative fees associated with having an account with them.
So it's just the fees and the difference in the returns. There's no other, I guess that makes sense. There's no other like compounding going on that makes it worse. It's just caught in those interest rates. Okay.
It's really, if you think CalPERS is, again, it's back to aligning the horizon with what your goals are. If you're going to be investing over a really long time horizon, CalPERS invests over a really long time horizon. You might want to be paying down those long bases. That's certainly something to consider.
And what set the investment policy on the trust?
What set the policy?
Yeah, how is that set?
Council, with staff recommendation.
So you recommended a fairly conservative investment.
This happened, it was established in 2017. It was our initial contribution year. We chose PARS. There are now more people in the market, but at the time they were, I think, one of the only, if not the only. And since we hadn't necessarily figured out the future, we kept it in it's not in the most conservative, but it's in the second most conservative. I think it's moderately conservative. But they have all the way up to, crazy, just ride the market, and if you want,
Well, this is
asset
all
allocation.
Like bonds and debt, mostly investments.
I'd have to go look at the report. Depending on our profile, they'll have different makeups of the investments. They do have a lot more flexibility in what they can invest in versus, say, if we were to keep the money in-house.
Okay, just a couple quick questions so the COLA decrease, again, is that a difference if we're assuming a 3% COLA and they're assuming a 2.7? Do we end up, again, diverging?
Yeah, so I was able to look at the past couple of years of actual salary growth for the city for what CalPERS had on their reports and just do a quick calculation there. So for miscellaneous, the CalPERS salary growth from 18 to 19 was higher at 5.3, 19 to 20 was 3.7, but then 20 to 21 drops to 2.0. So you're higher, and then much below the CalPERS overall benchmark. And again, that 2.75 does not reflect the full totality of salary growth that gets incorporated into the CalPERS actuarial model. On the safety side, it's a very different story from what CalPERS includes for their payroll numbers. 18 to 19 was virtually flat at 0.0038%, but 19 to 20 reflects essentially a catch-up year from that with 10% growth because it had been so long and the alignments that needed to happen. And then the third year was much lower, again, virtually flat as a result of some of the reductions and everything we've done.
Okay.
So something to remember when we're looking at year-over-year salary growth is not only do salaries impact that, vacancies impact that, cuts or adds impact that as you're changing your headcount within an organization. So purely looking at year-over-year growth in our salary and say a labor contract or something like that from a COLA perspective, it's simplifying the equation too far.
Okay. And then just one question on packet page 76. I just want to understand, it's a small thing, but so it says if an employee's service ends and they don't meet the eligibility conditions, they can actually get their money out. Does that happen very often?
I don't know.
Okay.
Those are personal choices by employees. They don't get the city's contribution. The city's contribution stays in CalPERS. They only
Okay.
get their employee
So
contribution.
if somebody leaves public service, or does it include people going to other cities or not? That-
It's a choice, actually. Someone could choose if they wanted to cash out if they were going to another city, but then they would essentially get re-enrolled. So,
They'd start over, so they could roll it over.
but you have reciprocity, so it also depends. These are personal choices.
Yeah, and I think one of the things we've all been trying to figure out is, as the nature of public employees is beginning to change, everybody used to sort of go into public service as a career, and, as that changes,
Yeah.
are we more likely to see more employees
Yeah,
cashing out and
So
moving
if they
in and out
cash
of the
out-
private sector?
yeah, just so I understand, so if they cash out, but the city's contribution stays in our fund, then that kind of helps us, right?
Yep.
So if we have an up or out policy as a city. Okay. But this changing nature of employment is actually potentially helping us at the same time that people are living longer, and, we have to have more to cover that. Okay.
Yeah, I would guess there's a lot more people living longer than there are people opting out.
I will just add to that, and it's something that we kind of talked around a little bit in the presentation tonight, but was not made explicit. PEPRA and the full impact of PEPRA for employees who are now entering the public sector for the first time has yet to be fully realized in these actuarial reports. It's a big kind of delta. It's out there. It's one of the big unknowns. But as someone starts with the city now, they are not eligible for the full benefit. They are only eligible for the PEPRA benefit. And that should have an limiting impact on our long-term liability as we go forward due to the different benefit structure.
Can you explain that a little more? So, yeah, what's the difference?
Sure. So the difference is in the different tiers of plans. Right. And I don't have the page number.
Packet page 3 or report page 2. The biggest difference that you're going to see is the years of service eligibility, and that in PEPRA, there's a cap on the salary that's pensionable.
Okay, so it's really the cap that's the biggest difference, right?
So it's in the footnote. Right now, PEPRA employees are only eligible for a pension based on a salary at a max of $146,000.
And is that set by the state?
And building on your comment of a moment ago, if you're trying to figure out who might be more likely to move out of service into another sector, multiple studies have shown that nationwide, government tends to pay better than the private sector at entry-level positions, but when you get into senior management positions, government tends to pay considerably less than the private sector.
Yep.
So for senior management positions, the PEPRA ceiling on those higher salaries combined with, starts to make the private sector look considerably more attractive, perhaps, going forward.
And then I guess the other force on that is you've gotten this time into this pension plan, so you have to make that judgment, right, whether you should.
It can come with you. So as long as you're vested in the program, your time and your pension will come with you.
Even if you go into private sector.
Correct.
But it'll be smaller,
It'll be smaller,
right?
okay.
So you've
Yeah.
left, so
that
now it's
you're making that
capped.
trade-off.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. You will not earn any more years of service while you're in the private sector.
Okay. Okay, so what's the plan? This is gonna come back, we're gonna talk about policy, just one time or two times?
One for now.
I think we have so many other things on our docket that trying to get through it in one would
Yeah.
make a lot more sense.
Yeah, I'm just a little concerned because it's a very complicated issue. You spent all this time explaining it to us, and if we run out of the calendar year, you're gonna have to do it all over again, right?
Especially if we forget.
And then actually on that, you're hoping for us to have some kind of understanding and recommendation on some of these pension policies, and then we would take it to council too, right?
Correct.
Yeah, so I would
And
just
we're gonna
pay
have to-
attention to that. If you think you need to come back a couple of times, let's get ahead of it so that we don't like hit December and it goes into January and we basically lose a lot of work.
Thank you.
May I just add one other thing in terms of future meetings, just for consideration? I know we get a quarterly sales tax informational report, correct? I'm wondering, as we look at the transient occupancy tax becoming an increasingly big part of our revenues, if it would make sense to get a similar quarterly informational report on the hotel tax.
We are in the process of actually changing how we administer that potentially, so let me take that under advisement
It's
as
just,
part of that.
yeah, not a today, tomorrow,
No,
even
understood.
this month, but just as we reflect on, I find the sales tax information very helpful, informative, and certainly, you know, I think it's something that would be beneficial
Understood.
data for us to have from a city perspective, informed discussions with, you know, members of the public. Thank you.
Great. All right, so do we have any, so I guess we'll close this item.
Oh, sorry, I thought we were on this.
So is there any other discussion about future agendas?
I will cop to that we technically have a meeting scheduled on October 1st, and that is still our goal. Staff has reprioritized work and put everything on the back burner to focus on the direction that the council gave us a Monday ago on ballots. And so staff would like to come back to hash through next steps with the committee, but we are obviously running up very tightly against a deadline of packet has to go out on Thursday for the October 1st meeting.
Is that the only item?
Yes, because staff fully put
Focused
everything
on it.
else on
Okay.
hold in order to do that. The other item we were potentially going to look at is most likely going to come in October 15th, which there should be space on the agenda for.
So I'm sure you're managing it. I guess if you can get most of a staff report, we can have an update through a presentation or something at the night of the meeting, right?
So let me
I
just
appreciate that
translate that.
flexibility.
We should continue to hold October 1st, but it's possible that meeting will be canceled, so we can have a more robust discussion on the 15th? Yes?
I think
Or
what
were
I
you
heard
saying
the chair
something else?
say is if we need to supplement the staff report with a presentation, because we're still putting things together, that he was supportive of that.
Okay, so we're
Keeping
still
the
planning
first.
for the 1st, but we
Yes.
might get the information in 2 stages.
Yep,
Thank
real
you.
time.
Thanks for the flexibility.
We appreciate that.
Okay, anything else? All right. Thank you for going through this tonight. Meeting adjourned.